If you thought you knew greed, man, were you wrong. What's up everybody, I am Jasprit Singh and welcome to the Minority Mindset. Is greed good? If you've seen the Wall Street movies, you might remember the speech by Gordon Gekko, the Wall Street tycoon, when he talked about greed. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, greed, or lack of a better word, is good. But being where we are today in this 2020 financial mess, is greed still good? And if so, when? When you go to the Gucci store? Hold that thought. Greed isn't one size fits all. It comes in a lot of forms, kind of like Chipotle bowls. Sometimes you get a lot of rice, other times you get a lot of beans. Greed is what pushes people to work harder at their job, that way they can afford that trip to Disney World with their family. But greed is also what drives some politicians to hear that a pandemic is coming, and then they call up their stockbroker to have them sell their stocks before they let the public know, and then they try to downplay the problem. That's why today I want to talk about greed. Specifically, how greed played a part in this 2020 financial mess. So make sure you watch this video until the end because you don't want to miss any of these key details and you want to make sure that you can take care of your finances and your family's finances. But before we get into that, hit that thumbs up button below because if you don't, then YouTube doesn't share our video with anybody else. Subscribe to the Minority Mindset YouTube channel. That way you don't miss our new financial education videos every single week. And hit that little notification bell too, because if you don't, then YouTube doesn't let you know when the new videos are released. Let's start by taking one step back. A little bit more. Okay, there. Greed has a lot of faces. People blame banks for their greed during the 2008 crash because banks made a lot of risky loans to people who couldn't afford them, and then banks gambled on those risky loans, that way they could 10x or 100x their profits. And yeah, banks made some really bad and greedy decisions, but banks weren't alone. They were only able to do that because people were greedy too. You had people making $75,000 a year who would write on their mortgage application that they were making $110,000 a year, that way they could qualify for a bigger loan. Isn't that greed? No, that's just fabricating. You had people buying huge homes that they couldn't afford with no down payment when they had no savings and no investments because they wanted to be that cool couple with their friends. Isn't that greed? No, everybody does that. And you had people living in homes worth $300,000 who would then hear about the possibilities of refinancing, so then they would call up the bank and ask to take out $350,000 through this refinance. That way they would have some extra cash for a nicer car, a first-class ticket to the Bahamas, and maybe a trip to the Gucci store. Isn't that greed? No. Yeah, that's greed that pushes people to do that. Nobody sees greed as a problem when it's happening. Greed only becomes a problem when it starts to hurt. Ouch! Greed, why'd you do that? In 2005, when that guy making $50,000 a year bought that big, beautiful mansion and then he drove to his closing in the Benz, nobody thought that he was being greedy. I mean, his real estate agent loved it, his mortgage broker loved it, his bank loved it, his car dealership loved it, and he was living the American dream. He wasn't doing anything wrong, and his life was a fairy tale. It wasn't until that fairy dust started to fade away in 2008 when people started to care about greed. Greed. When it's controlled, greed is what pushes people to follow their dreams and goals. At that stage, it's called passion, maybe even hustle, and is encouraged. So what differentiates greed when you're being greedy by working harder at your job, that way you can afford your dream BMW, or so you can afford that trip to Disney World with your kids, and the greed that banks have to make risky loans, that way they can make more profits. Simple. Greed is good until it's abused. Just like anything else, too much of a good thing can be bad. I mean, without some greed, you wouldn't have people working really hard at Apple to create your iPhone. And without some greed, you wouldn't have an entrepreneur work really hard to create YouTube. You mean there would be no more random guy on YouTube? But when you get blinded by greed and you start abusing greed, that's when you start to make bad decisions. And while that's bad by itself, it becomes even worse when you see that same type of greed get repeated again and again and again throughout history. In high school, I took a European history class which bored me out of my mind, but I remember one lesson where we talked about how history repeats itself. And it made no sense to me. I mean, if we have textbooks telling us how things played out in history, how can we make the same mistakes again? Well, here we are in 2020 repeating history. Over the last few years, Greed is what pushed so many airlines to spend almost all their cash on stock buybacks, which would inflate the price of their stock, which would make the shareholders of these stock feel richer. And then you had some airlines like American Airlines that not only spent all their cash on these stock buybacks, but they went into debt. That way they had extra cash to buy back their stock. That way their owners would feel really happy. And now you have to come in and save them, taxpayers with tax dollars, because airlines spent $45 billion on stock buybacks, and now they need $50 billion to bail them out because they don't have any cash left over for emergencies. And kind of as a funny aside, so the American Airlines CEO sent out an email to everybody who flies with American Airlines, and I got the email, and he writes how American Airlines is working to enforce social distancing guidelines, and then he goes on to say that he has so much gratitude and thanks to the United States Department of Treasury for their unwavering support. They should put that on their planes. American Airlines, funded by American taxpayers. Excessive greed is what we saw in 2009 when the Federal Reserve Bank cut interest rates again and again and again while they said that consumers are strong and we are living in the strongest economy ever. You generally see interest rates cut when you are in a slowing economy or a recession, because when you cut interest rates, it makes it easier for people to go out and get a loan and go shopping, and it makes it cheaper for businesses to go out and borrow money and invest in their business. So cutting interest rates is a way to stimulate the economy. Now, you might be wondering, if we were in such a strong economy in 2019, why were we cutting interest rates? Greed. I mean, that's the whole topic of this video. Americans were already leveraged to their eyeballs, so they couldn't afford to spend any more money because we already had a record amount of credit card debt and student loan debt, and it was hard for businesses to borrow more money because we already had a record high amount of corporate debt. So if people and businesses are already leveraged to the max, how can you encourage them to borrow more money and spend more money? Simple. Just make it easier for them to get more debt, you silly goose. It seemed like no big deal at the time, unless you were subscribed to our YouTube channel, because we talked about this very thing when it happened, but people loved it because now they could go out and get more debt because it was cheaper, and businesses could borrow money for less interest. By the way, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, you should do that. Well, that greed ended up biting us in the you-know-what, because it gave the Fed very little wiggle room to stimulate the economy when this whole 2020 crisis started. During the 2008 crash, the Federal Reserve Bank was able to cut interest rates from 5.25% in 2007 to 0% in 2008. Now in 2020, we were only able to cut interest rates from 1.75%, which is what it was in the end of 2019 after all these rate cuts, to 0% in 2020, because we already stimulated our economy when it was growing. Excessive greed is what pushes politicians to hear bad news about the pandemic coming, and then the first thing they do is call up the stockbroker and tell them to sell their stocks before they tell the American people. And excessive greed is what pushes some influential people in power to print trillions of dollars to bail out who they want to bail out at your expense. Taxpayers. Not only do you have to pay for these bailouts with your tax dollars, but every time more money is printed, the value of each dollar you save and the value of each dollar you earn drops just a little bit. That's why the prices of everything around you, your trips, your cars, and your rent keep going up. It's not the first time we've seen this happen, and I don't think it's gonna be the last. Greed is great when it's contained, because that's what passion is. But when greed gets abused, that's when greed can be a... You can fill in that blank with whatever you want. Monkey, when your greed becomes so abusive that it gets to the point where innocent people have to come in and rescue you because of your greedy mistakes, that's when it becomes a problem. But it happens on smaller levels too. Remember that Chipotle bowl example I gave you earlier? When greed takes over, the logical part of your brain leaves, and I'll show you what I mean. In the late 1990s, if you started a company and you threw in the words .com at the end of it, you were pretty much guaranteed to be worth millions. And so people got really excited and they didn't want to miss out on the opportunity to get rich quick. So they started blindly investing in these .com companies, even though they had no idea what these companies did. But that's when the fairy dust faded away and the people that got greedy were left with nothing. In the mid-2000s, everybody said that real estate was the way to get rich. The government said it, your bank said it, even your mailman said it. And so everybody wanted to be a millionaire, so everybody started loading up as much debt as possible to buy real estate, even if they had no idea of how real estate worked. Then, when the fairy dust started fading going away, the people that fell into the greed were left with a whole bunch of debt and nothing to show for it. In 2017, Bitcoin was the way to get rich because everyone said that if you just invested $1,000 in Bitcoin, you would have $10 million or something like that. And so everybody and everyone's Uber driver was investing in Bitcoin, buying up Bitcoin, even if they had no idea of how cryptocurrency worked, because that was the way to get rich. If you just owned one Bitcoin for 6 months, you were guaranteed to get rich. Well, just as fast as the euphoria came, the fairy dust faded away and the people that got greedy were left with nothing. In each one of these scenarios, two things happened. First, excessive greed was exposed, which led to a crash. And second, the people that stayed patient and weren't bogged down by emotion were able to come in and buy great investments at a huge discount. Now, let's talk reality. We can't control what other people do. You can't go and tell banks to stop making risky loans to people who can't afford them. And you can't go and tell people to stop being greedy and going into debt to buy things that they can't afford. But you can control what you do. This is where financial education is so important because it helps you think clearly and see clearly during these clouds of greed. And with the right financial education, you will understand that money is just one aspect of your life. It's not your whole life. And what's kind of ironic is that with this clear thinking, you'll be able to make better decisions with your money because you understand how money plays a part in your life. If you are looking for an easy way to up your financial education, we have a free ebook on money management and investing that you can read for free when you sign up for our financial education emails, which are also free. By the way, our financial education emails are different from our financial news emails. So if you want to get a free ebook and get our financial education emails, you can do that by clicking the link up here or by clicking the link in the description below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, share it with one friend. That way we can help spread the word. If you want to learn more about a potential real estate bubble that we're brewing right now, I already made a video on it and you can watch this video on YouTube by clicking this button right over here. Thank you for watching and as always, keep hustling.